This video is the second on every president's post-presidency. The first video covered every pre-Civil War president's retirement, so this one will cover every post-Civil War president. Like last time, every president who died in office, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Abe Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, Warren Harding, FDR, and most recently JFK, will not be included in this video. So starting with Andrew Johnson, the first president after the Civil War, let's take a look at every president's post-presidency.
Andrew Johnson left office in 1869, having been impeached and otherwise politically attacked in all sorts of ways, and returned to his Tennessee home. Johnson, though he had been practically politically tortured for his years in office, still loved politics, or at least he liked them enough to try and return to the Senate. He failed at his first try, but on his second run, he got it. He is the only president to have become a senator after his presidency, but he didn't serve out his term and died just a few months in July of 1875. Grant was the first president to really try for a third term. In 1876, he was almost made the Republican nominee for president, but he wanted to be a write-in candidate like he was in 1868, where he wouldn't actually announce candidacy. In 1880, the same thing happened, but Grant actually said he'd go after the nomination himself this time. He got very near a third term, but again, things just didn't pan out. After this, he gave up politics and basically went on a vacation and saw places all over the world, from England to Africa, from the Middle East to Japan. Grant and his wife Julia traveled together. Grant was actually the first former president to have ever gone to Japan. And once they returned, Grant was the same old Grant, and like in his presidency and all throughout his life, he misplaced his trust and was in turn taken advantage of by shady figures. This time, he made a poor investment, and in turn, his business partner basically took all of his money and ran. Grant was dirt poor and, after a cancer diagnosis, about to die. Grant knew that if he just gave up without a fight, he would leave his wife, his children, and all of his family in debt. He couldn't let this happen, and though he couldn't take a single breath without great pain because of his throat cancer, he would take up the task of writing his memoirs so that they would sell and leave his family enough money to live off of. To do this, Grant got the help and encouragement of Sam Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. In just the little last while of his life, Grant wrote over 2 volumes, 584 and 648 pages respectively. Grant would often write over 50 pages of draft in a single day, which is an amazing rate. He really gave it his all. He sent in his final draft and passed away just a matter of weeks later. The memoirs were published, and suddenly Julia and the whole Grant family were no longer in financial trouble. This last act of Grant's was really showing of the determination, hard work, and grit Grant had shown all the rest of his life. Hayes, like Polk, made a pledge that he would only run for and that he would only serve 1 term. He, like Polk, kept that promise. Hayes left office very popular. He could have had his second term just like that. So easy. Hayes was a great advocate for prison reform, the abolition of the death penalty, universal tax-funded education, and he spent much of his post-presidency advocating for just those things. When he died, Hayes' funeral procession was led by then-President-elect Grover Cleveland and future President William McKinley. Of all the presidents, only Jimmy Carter had a more influential or otherwise productive post-presidency. Arthur left the presidency on his deathbed, or at least practically on his deathbed in March of 1885. That's part of the reason he didn't actively seek to win the presidency in 1884. For the remainder of his life, he was too weak to even fish, which was one of his favorite hobbies. A couple of years after returning home, Arthur died and he was buried in Albany, New York. Cleveland actually had 2 post-presidencies, being the only president so far to have won the presidency, lost the presidency, and then won back the presidency. During his brief first post-presidency, Cleveland didn't really do much, and was just planning on how to get himself back to the White House. In 1897, after Cleveland stepped down for the last time, he moved to Princeton, New Jersey, where he served as a trustee at Princeton University. But this isn't all Cleveland did in his retirement years. He also invested a lot of money in the stock market and made a great deal of money off of that. Served on company boards, which were typically paid positions, and also gave speeches for cash. In 1904, when his daughter Ruth died, Cleveland was visibly aged and never fully recovered. In 1809, Cleveland had a heart attack and died just a few months later. Ben Harrison served just 1 term between Cleveland's 2 terms and was very unpopular all throughout. In retirement, Harrison gave lectures at Stanford University in California on constitutional law. Harrison also briefly represented Venezuela in a border dispute with the UK-owned British Guiana. Harrison lost, but his effort made people all over the world recognize that he was a great lawyer. On March 13th, 1901, after he caught a bad case of pneumonia, Harrison died. After Theodore Roosevelt left office in 1909 and then split the Republican ticket in 1912, which resulted in the election of Democrat Woodrow Wilson in 1912, he left the country. Only for a brief time, though, with his son, Kermit, so that they could explore the Amazon River and the Amazon rainforest. Roosevelt nearly died there, but miraculously survived and then returned to America. Back home, Roosevelt did what he did in all of his free time. He read and he wrote. When World War I broke out, and his son Quentin was shot down in his plane, killed, and then mocked by the German pilot who killed him, Roosevelt famously begged Woodrow Wilson to let him go to Europe and fight. Wilson denied the request. In 1919, Teddy died in his sleep. As a friend of his, Thomas Marshall, who was also vice president under Woodrow Wilson, said, "Death had to take him in his sleep because if he were awake, there would have been a fight." Taft had one of the more productive post-presidencies. Almost immediately after leaving office, Taft started teaching at Yale Law School. But in early 1921, then-President Warren Harding nominated Taft for the Supreme Court. Taft had then become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, if he only went for Speaker of the House of Representatives, he would have held all 3 of the highest positions in the United States government. The court is where Taft really wanted to be all of his life, and he was happy there. While in office, he gave the oath of office to Presidents Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. In 1930, Taft died while still on the Supreme Court, heart disease. After having suffered a stroke in October of 1919, Woodrow Wilson was almost completely incapacitated. In fact, his wife was practically acting president because she decided which information Wilson would see, what he wouldn't, and even just straight up made decisions for him. Wilson was in this condition from 1919 to his death in 1924. In spite of his condition, he considered running for a 3rd term in 1920, but thankfully, he didn't. He also continued to push for the League of Nations, which never really came to fruition. Wilson died in early February of 1924. Coolidge was the 6th accidental president, taking over when Warren Harding had his heart attack. However, unlike most every accidental president before him, with the exception of Teddy Roosevelt, Coolidge won re-election. When Coolidge retired, after he turned down a near certain opportunity for a 3rd term, he decided to go home to his New Hampshire home in Massachusetts. Why he turned down his shot at a 3rd term, a near certain chance, like I said, is something of a mystery. But for one thing, he probably just meant not to break the 2-term precedent. For another, Coolidge had tragically lost his son in 1924. The boy, John, was just 16 years old when he died, and his father wrote that the power and glory of the presidency went with him. From his office in the White House, Coolidge could see the tennis court where his son used to play. Of course, this was a terrible experience for anyone to go through. That's the best reason for turning down a third term most historians can figure anyhow. In Retiracy, Coolidge wrote his characteristically short and to-the-point autobiography, and he also wrote a number of articles on political issues for newspapers and magazines. On January 5th, 1933, Coolidge died from a heart attack. Hoover's post-presidency was one of the longer ones, lasting over 30 years. After reluctantly yet graciously handing the presidency over to FDR during the worst financial crisis the country had ever seen, Hoover retreated. He drove from D.C. all the way through Nevada City, California, where he worked as a young man, and down to his Palo Alto home. Almost all of the nation blamed Hoover for the Depression, and though he did the very best he could, he just couldn't have defeated it. While on a European tour in 1938, Hoover met with Adolf Hitler trying to negotiate for a food relief program in Nazi-occupied country, but Hitler shot this idea down and yelled at Hoover. After World War II, Hoover continued to work against world poverty and hunger, serving as the coordinator in the food supply for World Famine Organization. He also did similar in World War I, which is, in part, how he won the presidency in the first place. When Truman became president after the death of FDR, Hoover was invited back to the White House for the first time since 1933. Him and Truman were good friends. Hoover was also the first former president with a proper presidential library where basically all of his important papers and recordings from his life and presidency are. Later in life, Hoover wrote his autobiography and a number of other books on history. On October 24th, 1965, Hoover died from internal bleeding. Harry Truman, as I'll mention every time I mention him, who was my personal favorite president, left office very unpopular. Though he had already served nearly 2 full terms, he was technically able to serve a third. Having already pulled off a miracle with his 1948 re-election, Harry didn't want to push his luck. Besides, the presidency is already such a physically and mentally draining job. A third or fourth term can easily kill a man. That's the effect it had on Truman's predecessor, FDR, anyhow. As Eisenhower took the oath of office, former President Hoover turned to Truman and said, "I think we ought to organize a former president's club." The two being the only living former presidents, Truman replied, "Sure. You be the president and I'll be the secretary." And that's the origin of the Former President's Club, which exists so that former presidents can inform and advise the decisions of current presidents. Truman and Hoover were very good friends in Truman's post-presidency, probably one of the better and longer-lasting presidential friendships since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Anyhow, after returning to his hometown of Independence, Missouri, Truman settled down with his wife Bess and started planning their retirement years. One of Truman's pet projects was his presidential library, which he hoped would serve as a place where students from all over the country and all over the world could study his life and his presidency, and the effects it had on the world. Truman, who was always a big history enjoyer, didn't want his presidency, which covered some of the more important and transformative years in American history, to be lost. Moreover, he wanted to preserve his thinking and his decisions he made and why he made them. Truman saw this project through to its end and was very happy with its results. Truman also wrote his 2-volume autobiography as well as another short book talking about his retirement. All 3 books are very good and have great insights into Truman's thinking and personality. On December 26, 1972, Truman died at age 88. Ike had a relatively boring post-presidency, writing his autobiographies and then retiring to his farm near the battlefield of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Ike spent most of his post-presidency there until he suffered a heart attack in 1965 and then another in 1968. After the 1968 one, he was hospitalized and stayed in that hospital until his death in March of 1969. LBJ, our most recent accidental president, like most of the presidents from his generation, had a very quiet post-presidency, just writing his memoirs, working on his presidential library, and keeping to himself on his Texas ranch. Johnson died just one day before the official end of the Vietnam War. After resigning the presidency to avoid his near-certain impeachment and removal from office, and then being pardoned by Gerald Ford, Nixon returned to his California home. In retirement, Nixon's main priority was getting himself out of debt, of which he had a lot of, both legal and personal. To do this, Nixon took basically any opportunity to make money. This included television interviews, writing his memoirs, and selling all of his offhand property. He was also a diplomatic expert all throughout his life, and he wanted to advise other presidents when crisis came about. Nixon also worked on a presidential library, but it was never made an official presidential library until after his death. In 1994, Nixon had a stroke and died. Gerald Ford was the first president to use his office for personal financial gain, which is funny because he never won it for himself, instead being inserted, not elected, into the vice presidency and then becoming president after Nixon resigned. He wrote books, promoted items, and other things of that sort in order to make a profit, using the presidency as a sort of tool. In 1980, Ford tried to get the vice presidency with Reagan, though Reagan thought this was a bizarre request, and instead, H.W. Bush got it. In 1999, Ford was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton for healing the nation after Watergate, and in 2006, Ford died.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
Jimmy Carter has been having by far and easily the most productive post-presidency of any president. After losing re-election to Reagan in 1980, Carter returned to his Georgia home. But the still relatively young former president was hardly done with his career of public service. In 1982, Jimmy and his wife Rosalind founded the Carter Center Foundation, an organization which, to this day, is dedicated to the protection and preservation of human rights and democracy all over the world. Carter also uses his diplomatic experience from the presidency and applies it so that he can, as an individual without any official government authority, help and solve diplomatic issues. Carter also worked on his presidential library as well as a number of books, which include his autobiography. Ronald Reagan left office after seeing his hand-picked successor and Vice President H.W. Bush take the presidency. Reagan's retirement would have been unremarkable just working on his presidential library and his memoirs, if not for the tragic Alzheimer's diagnosis in 1994. His wife, Nancy Reagan, did most of Reagan's work past this point, speaking on his behalf and raising awareness about Alzheimer's disease. Nancy helped raise thousands, if not millions of dollars towards Alzheimer's and stem cell research, and the world is better off for it. 10 years after his diagnosis, Reagan died on June 5, 2004. H.W. Bush had an altogether boring post-presidency. His main priority in retirement was just to keep quiet and not be an inconvenience to any currently serving president. In 2000, when his son was elected president and then had one of the most turbulent presidencies ever, H.W. Bush still kept quiet. He said he'd only ever interfere if his son asked him to. Bush also decided to skydive for his 75th birthday, and did that every 5 years up to his 90th birthday in 2014. At age 94 in 2018, Bush died surrounded by family. Clinton left office when he was 54 years old, which is very young in terms of presidents. He, like most of his recent predecessors, worked on founding his presidential library and his incredibly popular autobiography. But the fairly young man still had plenty of energy, so he used his organization, the Bill Clinton Presidential Foundation, to help advocate and advance the causes of HIV research, racial justice, and fighting poverty, all issues Clinton is very passionate about. He also, to this day, is a valuable political analyst. In 2016, when his wife Hillary Clinton ran for president herself, Bill helped campaign for her, though their efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. George W. Bush, for the most part, has had an altogether quiet post-presidency. He's made sure to keep out of politics, even refraining from campaigning for his brother Jeb when he was trying for the Republican Party's nomination for president in 2016. Soon after leaving office, Bush took up painting, and in 2017 he published Portraits of Courage, a collection of 66 paintings he has done of veterans. Bush is the last of presidents that will be included in this list, seeing as both Obama and Trump haven't been out of the presidency long enough to have anything particularly interesting to write about. I'd like to thank the University of Virginia's Miller Center. The Miller Center has a whole series of articles on almost every president's post-presidency, and was a great resource. I'd also like to thank you all for watching so far through.